Chroma key is different than actual superimposition, in that with a super it's basically a half dissolve between a foreground and a background. In chroma key, or blue screen, you can have the full video of both there. What you're doing is just dropping out the background of a chroma key. In other words, if it's blue, you want the blue to disappear and not be seen by a person who is watching the image. So you have certain areas that you want to see, and there's certain areas you don't want to see. And by way of chroma key, you can do that, and it allows you to do that. Plus, it allows you to put people in situations that they could not normally be. Say if they were in a bell jar. Obviously, you can't get into a bell jar unless it was gigantic. In this case, you can make somebody very, very small, and by way of a chroma key, put them any place you want in the picture. Some of the other technical aspects of it is that the studio that Dark Shadows was shot in was a relatively narrow studio. And because of that, logistics really had to be worked out. We used primarily 3 cameras in the shooting of Dark Shadows. At times when it got more complicated, we used 4 cameras. But for the most part, 3, in conjunction with 2 booms and 2 boom operators. Sometimes we would shoot a scene that, say, required us to be in the foyer to start the show. And then the next scene would be all the way down the other end of the studio, which may be Rose Cottage or some other part of the set. That was done usually during the opening sequence, where you see the waves crashing onto the rocks. The cameraman had to race down to the other part of the studio, get there, and hopefully make it in time so that they didn't have to stop tape. And at that time, because, again, the mentality of it was that you want to shoot in real time, you had to try to make everything work in the time frame you had allotted to make your certain moves. So during the day, especially earlier on, when the cameras were blocked out, where the director's on the floor physically placing cameras and artists where they're going to be, some of those logistics had to be worked out time-wise. And as I said before, hopefully make it in time and make everything work. Occasionally it didn't, and we had to stop tape. But that was difficult. Because of the equipment at that time, it used 2-inch tape. 2-inch tape was very basic up until that point, in that you had a very crude way of editing. It wasn't, at least earlier on for this show, with a razor blade. At times people had to edit tape with razor blades. Sometimes it was much more expedient to edit a piece of tape with a razor blade. But most of the time it was edited on an electronic machine that allowed for the electronic editing rather than the physical splicing of the tape. The tape recorders, devices used to record the show, were not physically located in the studios or their control rooms. They were in a central area at that point in time in the main building at ABC. And one of the main reasons for that was the fact that they were very costly and they had a limited amount, and they used to share the machines among the shows. So basically there was a window of time to which our signal from the studio was sent up to the main building, recorded there, and hopefully in that window everything made it on tape. Otherwise they would have to extend the tape time and possibly move somebody else down the line a little bit if they were going to record. And at that point in time, needless to say, there were many other shows going on at ABC, and there were a certain amount of machines that were assigned for doing the records from the different studios. From a point of view of maximizing its usage and minimizing the amount of equipment necessary to do all these, this is the way ABC worked it out. But also, because color was just coming in at that point in time, generally with the networks, there weren't that many color videotape machines around. Many were black and white. Again, as years go by, they were upgraded and you had more and more color there, and then they improved upon the color. Color was divided into an older type recording process and a newer type recording process. And if you had to edit that videotape, they were not sure when they took it back, whether they would have a newer processor or older processor. So consequently, 2 copies of the show were recorded at the same time. And depending upon which machine assembly process they were going to use, they would use either one tape or the other. These days, the machines are small enough and cheap enough so that most studios, as a complement, as well as a camera, would have tape machines assigned to it. So it makes the process a lot easier. And now that we're getting into the digital age, they're recording it on hard disk processes. In other words, much like you have a hard disk on your computer, you can record video and be able to edit, and it actually makes the process a lot easier all the way around. Plus the fact that it is digitized, the color deterioration or deterioration of image is greatly reduced. Well, for me this show is a little different in that I was very young when I started on the show. I was probably one of the few people that actually, as from a technical point of view, had seen it as a regular viewer, and then later on was able to work on the show before it ended in 1971. And during that time, I saw a progression of how the artistry, technically, it had advanced. As I mentioned before, the show was shot real time most of the time. But in its last couple of years, we also would shoot pre-tapes. And what a pre-tape is that a certain segment would be recorded on tape with certain sets in position and then put on the shelf for a week or two. And then when it came time to incorporate those scenes, we would roll them back from the main building, take them through our switcher, and use them in conjunction with the particular programming we had for that particular day. This is how the accomplishment of the changes of characters, especially in parallel time, occurred, and occurred quickly. Obviously, it was hard for somebody to change costuming very quick. Broadway actors and actresses, obviously, are used to that, but in television, that didn't occur all that easily. So there were segments that were pre-taped with, say, certain costuming, certain scenics, and then magically, at a blink of an eye, they can be changed into something else. So we did make use of that, and that usually occurred on a day where we had additional time to shoot and additional time to integrate that program material in with the present day shooting. Usually the show was shot at least 2 weeks in advance. There were some days where we were very close to air because, as I said before, we did have certain days that were pre-taped, but the actual process of putting the whole show together and making a final product sometimes were days away. In one instance, I remember a young actor, or young actress, I should say, on the show was in a few scenes that were used later down the line in the programming sequence. However, she broke her arm, and broke her arm actually at the studio. She came in to do a voiceover for the beginning of the show where you hear the rolling of the waves and the crashing, and you hear a narrative. Well, she came in to do the narrative. The narrative was in the control room, except that somebody was trying to get out of the door at the same time she was trying to come in and hurt her arm. To such a point, her arm had to be set. So the writers got together real quick and made a point of a character or a ghost of sorts pushed her down a staircase, and that's how her arm broke. So they had to make mention and change the storyline a little bit in order for that little quirk to appear and be basically covered in the storyline.